All right, in this section, I just want to start talking a little bit about the main questions. And our first question, of course, was: is it good for me? And then the second question: is it good for all the other stakeholders? And in that case, we're looking at the consequences of an action, and that leads us to make a point here and a little bit basic ethical theory. There's two things you can look at. You can look at the action, you can look at the consequences. And some people say, oh, the action is wrong in principle. And if they say the action is wrong in principle, there's something just wrong with the action in spite of the consequence. I'm going to put those in the camp called deontology, Deontology. That's a fairly esoteric term. We'll come back to that one. Those who look at the consequences are of course consequentialists. Well, that's really brilliant. But the consequentialists take on two stripes. One kind of consequentialist is basically looking at the effects for the individual, and that's a kind of theory we call egoism, which is a rather bizarre theory that we'll look at in a minute. And the other theory is called utilitarianism, and that's where you're looking at the utility of everybody, more or less. So we're talking then about the consequences for the self or the consequences for others. All right. Now, let's take a look at then this question: is it good for me? And that will lead us to this, I think, rather strange doctrine called egoism. I want to come back to the question of what really counts as good in a kind of other section. But at any rate, egoism takes two forms. First form is a kind of ethical egoism. Everybody should look out for their own interest. Well, that's kind of strange ethical doctrine. We've always said ethics is a social thing. It's there basically for the community, so it goes against that particular thing. And it's also incoherent. I mean, if everybody's looking out for their own interest, nobody will look out for anybody else's. It's incompatible with things that we're very familiar with, that we get involved in, advising, giving advice. And the function of advice is to look out for the interest of the other. So giving advice would be incompatible with egoism, wouldn't it? Yeah. It's also incompatible with friendship. We think in terms of friends at times, we should sacrifice ourselves for that. And you could kind of save it by saying, well, everybody should look out for my interest. But then the question is why? They don't even know me. And if I say I should look out for my interest, well, then it's everybody look out for their own interest. So it's a badly formulated formula. It's also, and this I always find interesting, it's also inexpressible. I mean, the clever egoist, if you really believe that you ought to look out for your own interest, now you're not talking about everybody, you're just saying you ought to look out for your own interest, or you say everybody, then why would you say that? It would be in my interest if you looked out for mine, right? It would be in my interest if you were altruistic toward me. So you can't even express it. So that's a kind of a really inexpressible, incoherent theory. Now that's the ethical one. Everybody should always look out for their own interest. But let's change it a little bit, because there are some people out there who indicate that they think everybody always looks out for their own interest. Now, I'm underlining the always there, and in this description, this is not normative. This is not saying what you should do. This is describing what people do. Does everybody look out for their own interest? And that depends. I mean, people think that, no, people don't always look out for their own interest. And they give examples of Mother Teresa giving up her life for that sort of stuff, or the soldier jumping on the grenade to save his fellow soldiers, or people doing, noble things out there for other people. All right. But there are other people that say, no, underneath it all, they're really looking out for their own interest. And that's called psychological egoism, and it's a kind of determinism. Now, on the whole, I find it a doctrine that if it's a psychological doctrine, it's not too scientific because it fails two scientific tests. And one of the scientific tests is it's non-falsifiable. There's nothing out there that would happen that falsifies the theory, right? I mean, if everybody's always looking out for their own interest, How about the boy who helps the lady across the street? Well, somehow that's in his interest. Well, how about the guy who jumps on a grenade? Well, somehow that's in his interest. That is, nothing will count. And if you protest and say once in a while I do something for somebody else, they'll say no, 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 no. Subconsciously, you're really looking out for your own interest. So you can't falsify it. And then the second good characteristic of a scientific theory or a scientific statement that can stand scrutiny, all right, is that you can predict with it. Well, if everybody's always looking out for their own interest, then we don't know when somebody's going to help somebody else. All right, now, that wouldn't be much of a problem, except in business and in economics. We get a kind of theory of economic determinism, and the theory and the picture of the rational man, the rational profit maximizer. All right, so that in economic theory and thereby predicting behaviors, all right, people tend to say everybody's looking out for their own interest. I think the moderate position and the common sense position to take would be simply this. Very often, quite often, people are looking out for their own interest. And if we don't recognize that people are looking out for their own interest, we're not going to see one of the great motivating factors in human behavior. All right. So let's grant that people are oftentimes looking out for their interests, and probably more often than not. I'm a bit skeptical about people who say people can be purely altruistic and people can keep operating for simply ethical, moral motives. We'll see in a minute why I think that. And this will lead us eventually to take a really, really quick look at Adam Smith. Okay? And The Wealth of Nations and some economic theory. Okay, so much so. Okay, now, what I want to say, though, is this, all right? People should look out for their own interest. But we've got to figure out a few things here. And so we've got to talk a little bit about what is good and what's in people's interest. Do that in the next section.